I am Glenn Norman, an Alberta cattle farmer and VP of Policy for the NFU. It is my pleasure to be your MSC today. The National Farmers Union is a membership-based national organization for the collective voices of Canadian farmers working together to fight for agroecology and food sovereignty. Farmers are our membership, but non-farmers are also invited to join as associate members. Together, we will build a farm and food system that works for all of us as people. We would like to celebrate our sponsors who made this workshop possible and have supported and worked with the NFU for many years. Thank you for sharing our vision and for supporting the work. We would like to highlight that the upcoming workshops in November, accumulating with our dynamic national convention, which is true democracy in action. We hope you'll join us for that as well. I would note that the BIPOC working group that is meeting next Monday is currently seeking to work solely with BIPOC farmers and eaters. Please join if that is you. I also would like to mention that we have a recent report on the lack of abattoirs and cut and wrap facilities in BC. The issue of lack of small abattoirs from which farmers can send their cattle other than to the big multinationals is a very important issue. And if you want to see this report, it's referred to as a vibrant small-scale meat industry for British Columbians. NFU recommendations to the BC Ministry of Agriculture. You can find it at nfu.ca, and I believe we can put up a URL here as well. So without further ado, I am pleased to introduce to you our speakers. Devlin Kuyek is a researcher at GRAIN, a small international not-for-profit organization that supports small farmers and social movements in their struggles for community-controlled and biodiversity-based food systems. He monitors and analyzes global agribusiness, including the global land rush and corporate concentration in the livestock sector. Devlin co-authored the major 2018 report, Emissions Impossible: How Big Meat and Dairy Are Heating Up the Planet. Based in Montreal, he spends his time supporting GRAIN's partners and staff globally as much as possible. And our second speaker is Tony McQuail. Tony McQuail was an early adopter of rotational grazing and has decades of experience in pasture management and fencing systems. At Meeting Place Organic Farm in Lucknow, Ontario, the McQuail family raises grass-fed and grass-finished beef, pastured pork, and pastured poultry, and has experimented with cocktail cover crops. They often use horses for farm work. Under their nearly 50 years of stewardship, the farm's soil organic matter has risen from 1.5% to between 3.5 and 7%. Tony and his wife, Fran, continue to be actively involved after transferring the farm operation to their daughter, Katrina. Tony, who has a degree in environmental studies, is also active in knowledge sharing through on-farm apprenticeshiping and farm training programs, developing government policy, and his involvement in several farm organizations, including the NFU. So if you'd like to take it away, Devlin.
Thanks. Oh, just as I feared, the construction site beside me is starting up here. Sorry for that. I am in the urban center of Montreal on traditional unceded Mohawk and Anishinaabe territory. It's very nice to be with you, to see familiar faces. A little sad that we can't hang out before and after the session, this convention. But it's a real honor to be with you. A little daunting too, because speaking on a topic that probably every one of you knows better than I do. So looking forward to the question and answer session. I see Darren is there, and actually that's where I wanted to start things off. Thinking about corporate power, I mean, the NFU is the best research and analysis on this issue, I think, anywhere on the planet. So, you know, let's begin with what the NFU has done, because I think that really centers things well. And then from there, I just want to bring out some other themes or some other aspects about corporate power that we are seeing globally that I think are quite pertinent for what is being faced here in Canada, and could help, I think, with what the NFU's ongoing work on this issue. So yes, let's start with this slide 1 here. So I hope you have all read and are very familiar with the 2008 report on the cattle sector that Darren did such a great job with. This, you know, the central question there was why, trying to explain the cattle price collapse, why farmers were faced for such historically low and low prices, and this sort of new normal. And the central message in that report was all about corporate power, and then sort of trying to explain, well, how did this come to be? And the report singled out, I think was really quite nice, the C5 syndrome. And I put it in 3 points, bringing a couple of the C's together there. But the first one is really all about corporations, right? So Cargill entering the Canadian market, and its presence expanding, and this sort of consolidation and capture by corporations of the Canadian processing sector. This was facilitated by the free trade agreements, which is sort of the second of the two of the C's here, the Canadian-U.S. free trade agreement, and then NAFTA. Of course, these are hugely important to how corporations consolidate their power. And then what also was highlighted was captive supply, which is just one of the sort of mechanisms that corporations use when they have this position of power to squeeze prices, to extract wealth. Captive supply, just for those who don't know, is when a processor also has its own cattle and can play off against the purchase of cattle from farmers by purchasing its own and then squeezing farmers and forcing them to sell at a lower price. So there are all kinds of mechanisms like that, and I've just to refer to that as kind of the lack of protections that farmers have when faced with these monopoly practices of companies. And that frame is, I think, extremely important to looking at this issue, and it's something that farmers are faced with increasingly around the world. All these trends have really only deepened and spread globally. As far as corporations go, you have new companies entering. Now you're all familiar with the Brazilian company JBS, I'm sure. But there's also, you know, WH Group, which owns Smithfield. It's one of the largest, it is the largest pork producing company in the world. It's based out of China. You have a company like Charoen Pokphand from Thailand, which has now also entered into the Canadian market with a takeover of High Life. But it's a major producer of pork and poultry. So you know that there's not like there's a lot of more competition, but there's an increasing amount of corporate control happening um, around the world. And maybe Tim, if you could just sort of jump over to the next slide. We try to put some of these numbers together with Darren in that 2018 report that got mentioned earlier, looking at the emissions of the big companies. And what we found was if you take the top 10 companies from each of beef, chicken, pork, and dairy, that they now account for about a quarter of all global meat and dairy production. So just 10 from each sector. And some of those companies are in in the top 10 in multiple sectors. So it's really quite astounding the level of concentration we're seeing. And this is only this is much more severe if you look at the countries in which those top 10 companies are operating. And these countries tend to be the major producers and exporters in the world. So if you look at, for instance, with beef, Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, the EU, US, and Uruguay, and there's a bit in Japan, the overall extent of corporate concentration or corporate control of the beef market is over a third, 37%. Similarly, in the major dairy producing countries, 46%. Poultry, 47%. Pork, to a lesser extent, if you include China, where there's still a fair amount of there's less concentration, although that is changing very rapidly. But with pork, if you take China out of the equation, about a third of global production in the main producing countries is controlled by just 10 companies. With free trade agreements, the other sort of major block there, this too has only been increasing, especially through bilateral trade agreements. I guess going back 2 decades, so the fight was around the WTO, or it was around the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas. Well, we've seen this sort of expansion of bilateral free trade agreements, for instance, with the EU and Canada. But this is happening everywhere. Just this week, the whole block of Asian countries signed on to what's called RCEP, which is the most significant, largest the largest free trading bloc that exists. So, although there's been this kind of, especially in the Trump era, there's been a bit more kind of nationalization rhetoric, and that we see some tendencies toward that. There's also, on the other side, the free trade agreements keep being signed, they keep being negotiated. There's a constant push for it, and that perhaps with the Biden government too in the U.S. now, that's something that we see continuing, and so the need there to really step up to try to stop it. So there's more. I think the criticism and the critique of it and the opposition to it is stronger, clearer, but at the same time, this is the major mechanisms through which corporations can create a context for them to expand, and they will continue to keep pushing that. Tim, do you want to just jump back for a second? Yeah, and then on the issue of the lack of protections, there too, others can. What we see, there's just really no serious attempts to try to rein in the monopoly practices of these corporations. There is some movements in the U.S. now, some interesting things that that Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker have put forward, but that's a long way from happening. And despite the growing control that these corporations are exercising, really not much in terms of protections for farmers that have developed. And the result of that, Tim, if you want to just skip over a couple slides, next one. The result of all that is, back one. The result of all that is as one would expect, a huge amount of profit for these companies. Was waiting to hear the what Cargill's dividend payment was going to be this year. So, I mean, you're familiar with this in the sense that these companies tend to make the most money when things are the hardest on people, when there are the biggest crises. And this year, you know, in the midst of this full-blown health and economic crisis, Cargill's 125 family member shareholders paid themselves out their largest dividend in history, 1.13 billion dollars just in dividends. I mean, that's just, you know, that's not the only profits that they'll be making this year. A huge increase from the year before, and we saw this with multiple companies. Nestle paid itself out $8 billion in dividends. Bayer shareholders, Bayer, which took over Monsanto and is a real mess right now, you know, with just written off billions in dollars in losses, still managed to pay its shareholders $2.8 billion in dividends. Tyson, which was so much a part of the story of COVID outbreaks, and particularly in the U.S. Meatpacking industry, paid its shareholders out $600 million as it was talking, you know, claiming that it was in desperate straits and needed urgent government intervention to keep feeding people. And that was similar for WH Group, owner of Smithfield, perhaps one of the worst affected in terms of outbreaks in the U.S. at its meat processing plant. In the midst of the outbreaks, paid its shareholders out $500 million. So that's what you get when you have a situation of extreme corporate power like we currently have. So beyond just that sort of C5 syndrome that had been described in the NFU report, and which lays out really, I think, some critical focuses for farmers organizations and allies, and looking at how we can try to rein in corporate power. You know, where do we need to center our struggles? I just want to talk about a few other aspects that I think are important. Tim, if you can go to the next slide. Of course, climate crisis has been big on the NFU's agenda for the last years. The work is tremendous. I've listened in and watched a few of the latest webinars that Darren's been giving. It's fantastic. A real inspiration to farmers organizations around the world, I think, to everyone. And I do agree that this is a really key area to look at. Inevitably, you know, meat is gaining attention, agriculture as well, as far as its role in the climate crisis, both what it can offer in terms of solutions, but also, you know, the emissions that come from agriculture and the role it plays in environmental destruction, particularly the industrial model that has been expanding so rapidly, that is corporate driven. And in the report that we did in 2018 with IETP and with the help of Darren, we really wanted to center it on corporations, because to understand the emissions from the sector, you have to understand that most of those emissions are coming from a small number of corporations, and that the model that these corporations have built and are promoting is what is behind those emissions. They depend on growth, and that is core to who they are. Growth in exports, growth in overall production, growth in the production of feed crops. So, you know, here you have deforestation is intimately connected with that. And that's really what is the fundamental problem that needs to be addressed. And I think our reading of it is that these corporations have, you know, tried as much as possible to just lay low over the years. They haven't been active. They haven't been as active as, say, the fossil fuel companies, and trying to undermine even the notion of climate change. But they have been trying to put together their own arguments, their own science, to deny that they're a part of the problem, to always talk instead about how they feed the planet, the typical kind of greenwashing. And I think that is ramping up. You hear, there are certain companies are a little more active than others. Overall, there's very little monitoring of their own emissions that's happening. But it will always and inevitably be just a means to protect business as usual. So they will put as much of it onto farmers as possible. They say, farmers need to just get more efficient. They need to, if you look at a company like, say, Danone's strategy for emissions reduction, so much of it is really all about like what can happen at the farm level. It has nothing to do with what they might be implementing. And farmers have spent decades now trying to going so deeply into debt, trying to implement the kind of efficiency that these companies are demanding. So to imagine them, more and more being put onto farmers is really quite unbelievable, and it just won't work. And then of course they're doing things like they have startup companies that are or venture capital divisions that are investing in lab meats and alternative proteins, and I personally don't feel it adds up to much serious from their side, but it does help with their public image. And what's I think really critical to understand in this is that farmers' interests, by and large, do not align with the interests of the meat companies. It really have to. And I know I'm speaking already to groups who are saying this, but people are saying this. But I think a key message here is that it's not about supporting meat. It's not about just supporting agriculture. There is a difference between the agenda that the corporations have and those and the interest that farmers have here, and that the farmers' interest can align very strongly with the solutions that are being proposed, especially around things like the Green New Deal, when it comes to the climate crisis. And we do, it's inevitably have to move towards more moderate consumption of both meat and dairy in the countries that are over-consuming it, including Canada. And we have to share production. So, you can't just all be about, everything being exported from one country and farmers not getting to do dairy or livestock in other countries. That production has to be shared. We have to move to more ecological practices that have less emissions. And I know Tony's going to talk about this. But we have to move to a model of, less production, more shared production, and definitely a better sharing of the resources. You can't have companies extracting billions of dollars in profits for their shareholders when that production is becoming more scarce and when that needs to be shared. And so there organizations like the NFU, who have always shown leadership when it comes to things like supply management and really like strong leadership on social and environmental issues. I think there's a real opportunity here, and corporations. I think it has to be said. Just there's no room for them in this scenario. That model of growth and money for shareholders, it just doesn't fit here. We have to move back to more local food systems. Have to move back to smaller scale processing, worker-owned, farmer-owned processing, these kinds of things. So maybe the next slide now. Another issue I think is really key. Of course, with the pandemic right now, it's on everybody's mind. But diseases are a growing problem for industrial livestock production and the whole global meat industry. We've seen this with bird flu, swine flu, now African swine fever, which hasn't hit Canada, but is just a catastrophic pandemic in much of the planet, especially in Asia presently. And there's also, with COVID, not just the COVID-19 or the SARS SARS-CoV-2 that people are faced with now. But there's a number of other coronavirus potential diseases that are emerging from industrial livestock, and this is a really, I think, a very important thing to be aware of. And when we've been researching on this issue for a while now, and one of the things that I think is extremely important to highlight is the correlation that exists between the emergence of highly pathogenic viruses or other diseases in livestock, where you get these massive outbreaks or pandemics. And there's a correlation between that and the expansion of industrial livestock. So where the outbreaks seem to be the worst, where things seem to get the most out of control and out of hand, are in areas where corporations are expanding, that are being turned into sort of export production centers, where factory farms are starting to move in and take over, where you're seeing more centralized processing. With bird flu, when the first outbreaks occurred and the first cases in humans occurred, the industry, in collaboration with the World Animal Health Organization, the FAO, and others, blamed small farmers, blamed wet markets in Asia. These systems have existed for generations and generations, going back thousands of years, without any kind of outbreak like this. So, you'd think that the first thing you would look at is what had changed, and it was very little was said about what was happening in the bigger operations, and partly that was because even the inspectors weren't even allowed to go into some of these farms. But the more we looked, the more we found that, this is where the source of the outbreak was, and also the source of the spread. If you have a factory farm in an area where you have a lot of small farms, it acts like a bomb. It gets into the water, gets into the feed supply, it gets in some trucks, it gets into all the trading networks, and it just takes off. And the argument that the big industry will make is that they can't be safe, they can't be secure if there are small farms around them that aren't practicing their model of biosafety. So you get this corporate model of biosafety that's designed to protect a very fragile farming system, one where it's genetically uniform animals, thousands of them packed together, where there's all kinds of conduits going in and out that can spread disease. So you have to take extreme measures, and you get that being imposed, and it's impossible for small farmers to implement this. And it's a real travesty in that so many of these agencies, donors and others who have been pushing small farmers to adopt these industrial practices, high yielding breeds and commercial feeds, have now pushed them, and so many of these farmers are now in debt and trying to implement these practices, and then they become a risk for the industry, and they can't possibly protect their farms from the diseases that are spreading. So right now in Vietnam and China, millions of farmers are going bankrupt and being driven out of business because of the African swine fever outbreaks. And the corporations are sitting there; they're making lots of money because as you know from BSE here, when that kind of crisis strikes, the price goes up on their end, and they're able to capture the money either through imports or through ramping up some of their production. So these companies have made tons of money over the last little while, and they are working directly with the governments to take over in these countries where you have this long history and tradition of small scale livestock production. But on the other hand, I think that the sort of biosecurity myth, I would say, for the meat industry is really unraveling. With COVID-19, just the sheer numbers of outbreaks in the processing plants in North America and Brazil and Europe and other places show us that the way these companies are structured is unsafe for their workers and for surrounding communities. There's awareness that COVID-19 is part of the risks that occur when there's deforestation and humans and our footprint is moving into forests and into contact with wild animals. There's, I think, more awareness too about how factory farming itself heats up viruses. It creates an environment where a virus can go from a low pathogenic state to evolve quite quickly to a highly pathogenic state. And with COVID-19, we're seeing that in the mink farms in Denmark, actually, where there's a new variant of the virus that has emerged, and they've been forced to basically destroy all mink in the country. It's quite a strong example of that. And then, as I was saying, how disease spreads. So just as an example, with African swine fever, it's known that it can be passed through feed, and we saw that with the porcine diarrhea virus that affected North America a few years back. But no attention was being paid to commercial feeds, and still isn't really being paid to commercial feeds in many of the countries that are importing it now. And so there are huge risks for the spread of these diseases, and there's nothing at all really, I'd say, in most countries being done to protect farmers from that. So I think there's a real opportunity here too for the NFU and for others to counter this biosafety narrative. And to present a different model, one that that is far less risky, and that says that, hey, it's the industry that's liable, that's creating this risk for us. They need to be held responsible for it and accountable for it. And there are other ways to do livestock farming and to process meats that are much less risky, and that centers again around the same stuff as with the climate crisis and also tackling corporate power. Maybe next slide. I just want to end here, I think, so I can give some more time for discussion and also time for Tony. But just quickly, an area that we're looking at more and more because we see how central it is to corporate power is just the ways in which global finance works these days. Corporations, of course, even a company like Cargill, which is privately owned, depend a lot on global finance. They use tax havens and the whole structure of offshoring to avoid paying taxes and also to enrich their shareholders. This is just a common strategy now for almost all of the big meat and dairy companies. They are increasingly aligned with things like private equity. These are sharkish kind of financial beasts who use leverage and other devices to take over companies. It usually will involve stripping the assets of some of these companies or quite quickly forcing workers to get a reduction of wages. But their whole model is about just extracting wealth, and they're a big player in meat and dairy around the globe. Development finance institutes, so DFIs there, which can be development banks. They have them in the US and in Europe, and there are regional development banks like the Asian Development Bank, for instance. Also the World Bank's International Finance Corporation, which are very active in supporting and providing funding and necessary loans to these corporations. Corporations who have all kinds of access to funds, and they're still getting money from what are in some ways publicly owned development banks. I put there the example of Goldman Sachs and KKR. Goldman Sachs you probably know of from the subprime crisis and their role in the financial crisis of 2008. KKR is one of the most widely known private equity firms. Both of these companies have been hugely influential in the restructuring of the meat and dairy sector in China. directly involved, and also in supporting the expansion of certain corporations. So, they are key players in here, and they have they promote that expansion because that they can benefit from it. I could talk about JBS, but maybe I can get back to that a bit. But what I had wanted to say there was just that JBS, you may have such a huge player in Canada now, but globally, it's the largest meat company in the world. But that meteoric rise happened so fast, and it's not very well known. But one of the reasons why that happened was that they got tremendous amount of funding from their National Development Bank in Brazil, and also from their pension funds, Brazilian pension funds. Sorry, and that money that came in, one of the reasons why there was such a push to get that money to JBS was because then it could be then fed back as kickbacks to politicians, and this was exposed in testimony given by JBS's CEO a few years back. But just to say, there, I think, to understand that the real source of global finance right now, of money for global finance, what keeps it working, what keeps it, what fuels it, is the retirement savings of workers. And there's a little chart, I don't know if you can see it on the right, but if you look at, in terms of institutional investors, these are like the major sources of money for global finance. The biggest source is pension funds, by far. It's estimated at about $40 trillion US right now in deferred wages. So I'd rather call it deferred wages from workers. So the money from working people is going in to support and really fund the expansion of corporations and models of economic models that are destroying the future for working people. And we're seeing more increasingly as these pension fund managers look to find ways to keep the returns going that may be able to provide some level of retirement security, because for most working people now, they don't even have a retirement plan. There is no pension fund, so that's another issue here. But there's a scramble to find what they call alternatives. So this can be private equity. It can be, as NFU knows, farmland. So remember the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan investing in a farmland fund in the prairies. But like the public sector pension fund, Canada's public sector pension fund, is heavily invested in farmland in Australia and in the US. But also moving more towards the privatization of public infrastructure and services. So right now we have the example of the Rivera long-term healthcare centers in Ontario, which are shown to be very negligent in their care for elderly and protection from COVID-19, where you're having these huge outbreaks. Well, that long-term healthcare provider, the second largest for-profit long-term healthcare provider, is owned by the public sector pension investment board. So this is, in a sense, our money. It's working people's money, and it's being used. We've put it in the hands of Bay Street, put it in the hands of Wall Street, and they are investing that in these kinds of things. And it won't be resolved by just tacking on some environmental and sustainable or social guidelines onto their investments, or getting them to maybe divest from arms and even fossil fuels. I think it's really important for us to look at ways that we can get that money back and invest it through more publicly accountable, more public type institutions, and also consider, what would it look like to be able to provide security to people in their old age? Does the current system we have, is it equitable? Does it work for everyone? The answer is no. It's mainly designed to make profits for the investment managers and for the corporations who benefit from it. And this is a time when we need to look at things like a Green New Deal and others, where we can have our investments going in that direction, and where we can find other ways to support people in their retirement. So I just want to leave it there, and then there's so many people on this call, so take the conversation forward.
Okay, thank you, Devlin. We're going to go straight into Tony's talk next, and then we'll save questions for both presenters after the talk. So, Tony, are you there?
Thank you. Yes, I'm here. Glenn, can you hear me?
I can at that.
Okay. Well, after listening to Devlin, I wanted to share something that I've found very helpful over the years, and that's Stephen Covey's concept of the circle of concern and the circle of influence. And that if we worry too much about the circle of concern, our circle of influence contracts. If we spend our time in our circle of concern, it expands out into our circle of, our circle of influence, it expands out into our circle of concern. And one of the reasons I'm an NFU member is I'm concerned about these things that Devlin is talking about. But in terms of my personal area of influence, I can't do a whole lot about it. But by working together, there's a little more help that maybe we can, because these are big issues and big problems. I'm going to speak, and I'm going to try and speak slowly for our translators. Going to speak more about something that's very much been in my circle of influence, but also relates very clearly to my circle of concern. And that's the role of livestock in a diversified, ecological, or regenerative agriculture. And I'm going to touch on a number of issues as we go through it. But as we start, I'd like to say that I think we're at a very interesting time, because I believe that COVID-19 has created a dramatic increase in people's awareness of the problems with our existing system. And based on the sort of consumers and new people wanting to come to our farm and to get product from us and our daughter, has created a real hunger for a more local and accountable food system. And I think that that has powerful impact if we're going to try and promote both more local production and more local processing. But I always, at the start of these things, like to think about, what are we doing as farmers? What is our role? And personally, it's not to be a cog in a linear industrial food system. I see my role as a farmer to turn sunlight into something. And we're one of the few industries that plays with that magic of photosynthesis. The timber industry does, the forestry industry, the fisheries industry, and then as farmers. But you know, we deal in a magical industry. We take sunlight and we take water, we take soil and growing plants, and by our management of them, we create the miracle of food and fiber and possibly fuel. So what does livestock have to do with it? And when I'm talking about livestock now, I'm thinking about animals living on farms and being largely out on the land, not living in confinement either over or in large accumulations of their own waste. That's not where I think of livestock. I think that's as barely a livestock, or maybe next year's dead stock. But I think there were a number of people over the decades and even centuries who saw the importance of livestock. I come at it from a holistic management perspective. So Alan Savory has played an important role in recognizing that it's not the livestock that necessarily are damaging things, but it's how we manage livestock. And are we managing livestock to mimic the way animals behave and perform in nature? Or are we trying to impose on them an industrial model of existence that they were never designed for? So I'm going to list some things, and I'll try and go slowly for the translators, and it may not take too long. But it seemed to me when we were thinking about our farm 45, 50 years ago, that one of the real values of having a certain amount of livestock in our operation was that it would encourage us to have more forage in the operation. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we're keeping our ground covered for all the year or most of the year, which is protecting the soil. We're keeping living roots in the soil, which are helping create a more biologically diverse and robust soil microflora. And so that creates both, if you're doing anything with sort of mixed species pastures, you're creating greater biological diversity both underground and on top. So these are, I think, valuable in terms of what I would think of as resilience, or that greater diversity makes us less vulnerable when it comes to things like pests and diseases, soil erosion, rain, drought damage, those kinds of things. Another thing that if you have livestock out on the land is you're going to be spreading fertility around on your farm. And you're letting them do the work. You're not having to clean the yard all the time. But they're spreading both the macronutrients that farmers have been encouraged to buy in bags and the micronutrients that we learned that maybe we better not forget. But they're also spreading biological inoculants in their manure. So they're interacting with the soil microbiology to a degree in that respect. Of course, we can think of the value of livestock in making use of areas that are not suitable for cropping. And that's always been considered to be a good thing until you stick them all in confinement and then they can't go out and forage. I think one of the things that to me has been very important is the ability to, if you manage your livestock well, is to start reversing the movement of carbon dioxide out of our soils through the reduction in organic matter and the breakdown of the soil, to start moving that carbon dioxide back into the soil as we increase soil organic matter through either good cropping practices or maybe even turbocharged a bit with good grazing practices. Certainly, perhaps another self-evident thing is the getting an additional revenue stream on the farm, and watching the some of the graphs that Devlin put up of the collapse of market prices is. It was around in that time frame that we decided we were not interested in being wholesale livestock producers, and that would be better for us to produce a more diversified range of livestock, but to retail it to customers. At one point, we had been primarily producing lambs for the Toronto stockyards market, and realized that we were taking terrible risks in terms of market. We could spend a whole year producing lambs and watch them go for half price just by them changing the sale time at the stockyards. I actually got to watch that happen one week when I'd taken lambs in, and they moved the sale hour up 1 hour, and lambs that had been bringing $2 a pound the week before ended up running through the sales ring at 99 cents for an hour until the smaller Greek and Italian and Middle Eastern butchers showed up to suddenly say, oh, what's going on here? Why are things so low? And start actually bidding in competition to the big packers who had been buying lambs. So that really turned us into thinking seriously about retailing and producing lamb rather than selling lambs. And then we diversified as well. So that's one aspect of market diversification for farmers. But another aspect of livestock in terms of marketing or getting marketable value is that livestock can take a cover crop or a green manure crop or crop residues, and if they're allowed to eat them, then gain marketable weight, so that it's not just doing something for the soil and protecting the soil surface, it's also something marketable. And these points may not be in order of importance. They were in the order of which I sort of thought of them as I was thinking about today's presentation. But I've realized over the years that working with livestock means that there are living creatures that depend on me or other members of my family. And it's, COVID-19, I don't know if in other people's areas, but pet prices have gone through the roof. People are selling dogs for $1,500, puppies for $1,500, because people are so lonely. That hasn't been my problem this summer. I get to go out and be welcomed by a group of cattle who say, "Oh, are you ready to move me?" Well, we're ready to move. Show us that new grass. And also, I think in terms of society and in terms of our children, livestock have a way of teaching responsibility, interaction with somebody who's not your father or your mother. Livestock perhaps push fewer buttons than parents sometimes, but they also, in many ways, provide a sense of purpose and meaning. I'm not sure I'd go on as many walks as I would if I wasn't moving livestock on a regular basis. So there, for me at least, I think some mental and physical health factors that play in with our livestock. But I think there's also the aspect from an environmental and ecological or regenerative perspective that including livestock and livestock that are on the land means that you're probably going to have more species diversity in terms of what's growing on the land. There may be more areas for, fence rows, hedges, woodland edges, a whole variety of areas that provide more diversity and more habitat for other living creatures that aren't part of the farm and yet may play a very important role in the farm's performance, because those habitats can be places for insect-eating songbirds, the whole range of predatory, parasitic, beneficial insects, and of course the pollinators. And so by creating a more diverse landscape through the way we manage livestock and livestock out on the land, we create, I think, an overall healthier system. And instead of the biosafety, biosecurity approach of industrial sterilization, we end up with a community, an ecological community approach to biosafety and biosecurity that looks at diversity, that looks at a variety of organisms, looking after things that we don't even know we need to look after. And then there's an aspect of livestock being helpers or tools that we can use to accomplish things on our farm. When we're doing our best management, we use our livestock to clean up windfall apples in our orchard, to break pest life cycles, and to reduce disease problems by eating the apples and passing it through their system. We can use them for mowing, for some weed control. We can use them to get animal impact, which is using their hooves and of course their manure and urine to trample or fertilize areas, to do a bit of landscaping and break up sharp boundaries along stream banks or in other areas. And they also can be used instead of a cyclone seeder if you feed small legume seeds to certain ruminants, they'll spread it in their manure, and horses will do the same thing, so that you can both move seeds from an area where you've got a really nice diverse mix in your pasture. This works particularly well for dairy farmers. You pasture the dairy herd in this area that you want to take a bunch of mature seed from, and then you pasture them on an area where you'd like it to be deposited and move them back and forth between milkings. But you can also accomplish much the same thing by adding a bit of legume seed and possibly some smaller grass seed to your mineral mix that your livestock are consuming. So those are the things that occurred to me in terms of some of the benefits of livestock in the operation. There's certainly some challenges to having livestock in your operation, and that is additional management skills. Certainly fencing, though fencing has become easier and easier as electric fences have gotten improved and better. And if you're going to look to do retailing of meat, that involves dealing with customers. And some of us are farmers because we're a little introverted and would just like to be in the back 40 and not have to deal with anybody. So it's not necessarily for everybody. But it also can be kind of satisfying. Even if a couple of your customers are a bit of a jerk, if you're retailing to a number of people, having people say how much they appreciate your food and how much they appreciate the work you're doing sure beats going to the stockyards and feeling robbed of your year's work. So I know for us that has been a bit of an encouragement as well. Certainly one of the very real challenges that we face is the whole question of local processing, because as in the case of imposing industrial biosafety on small farmers, the industrial biosafety model being imposed on small local abattoirs and butchers and other food processing facilities has been a very negative impact, and I think also very unrealistic, because the plant that's operating a kill floor for a shift a couple of days a week is in a very different risk and health situation than a plant that's running 24/7. So we have a lot of work to do ahead of us to create a localized food production and processing system that meets local needs in a regenerative and ecological manner. But I think livestock can play a valuable role. And I think I gave a talk last week talking about agriculture, part of the problem or part of the solution. And I think if we can develop a truly regenerative agriculture, we're very much part of the solution, and we're a necessary part of the solution, because civilizations don't exist without a food supply. And so it's critical that we have a food supply that doesn't undermine our future in the various ways that Devlin was describing. We also need a banking system that doesn't undermine our futures, and a pension system that doesn't undermine our future. So we need to work on all these things. But as farmers, the place where we can work on it, the area that's in our daily circle of influence, is the management choices we make on our own farms. And so, if there's a way to look at how to have livestock in your operation, or to look at how we cooperate with neighbors so that we can bring livestock in, if we're a crop farmer, to do something with the crop residue and inoculate the soil with the rich microflora of their poop, there are ways we might change the sort of isolating our farms into completely separate units, even if you don't want to learn how to string electric fence yourself. So I think I'll cut it there as I look at the time, so that we have time for questions and time for discussion. But I'm certainly glad that we incorporated livestock on our operation. I think it really helped contribute to our ability to increase our soil's organic matter over the years. And we are on a fairly rolling piece of glacial moraine land. So our farm had been cash cropped for a number of years before we got it, with some not terribly happy consequences. So I think Kathy has a link to a little video that our daughter made for a virtual tour that she was giving earlier this fall, which she'll share with you if you'd like to see it in a little more detail. I'm not a great technical person, so I didn't try and do a whole lot with slides and stuff. And I apologize to the translators if I rolled too fast, but hopefully some of it got through.